"Welcome to Secret Story, Glenn. Can you press play for me?" Casey said, and I leaned across from the couch and pushed the button on the CD player. Immediately, the room was filled with the sound of a crappy rap song, as my sister began to rehearse her latest baton twirling routine, for the 50th time. Okay, maybe it wasn't the 50th time, but it seemed like it. There are only a certain number of times you can watch a skinny 12-year-old girl prancing around, throwing a baton in the air and catching it, and still stay interested, but I sat there dutifully, watching Casey spinning, gyrating and jumping in time with the music, in her bright lime green practice leotard, and silver shimmer tights. And the rather wicked thought crossed my mind, if she was a few years older, this might be more interesting. Welcome to the world of a 17-year. As the song reached its ending, Casey jumped in the air, and landed exactly on the last beat, holding the pose for the count of 2, and relaxing. "That was a good one," I said, and meaning it. "You might get a place this time." Casey looked at the clock on the wall, and said, "Aunt Stephanie should be here any minute now. We better tidy up and get ready for her." There wasn't really any tidying to do, just a matter of putting Casey's practice mat and baton away, so as she grabbed her things, she said, "I wonder what she looks like. I haven't seen her since I was, I don't know, 7 or something." "Probably hasn't changed much," I said, without much interest. My Aunt Stephanie was what people in my grandmother's generation called a change-of-life baby. That meant she was born right towards the end of my grandmother's childbearing years, long after Grandma thought she would have any more children. There were 4 kids in my mother's family. First, there was Uncle Max, then, 2 years later, Uncle John was born. Another 18 months down the track, my mother, Julia, came along, and everybody thought that was it, but then 12 years later, when Grandma was 46, she fell pregnant again, to everyone's surprise. And my Aunt Stephanie came into the world. Apart from being sisters, my mother didn't have much in common with Aunt Stephanie, but that's only natural when you think about it. By the time Aunt Stephanie was 6, and still playing with dolls, my mother was already 18, legally an adult, and probably playing a different sort of game, with boys around her own age, so it was almost like they were from different generations. I was born when my mum was 26, so Aunt Stephanie was only 14 years older than me, but when you're a kid, a person 14 years older is practically middle-aged. Aunt Stephanie lived in the same city as, until I was 12 years old, and she was 26. And that year, she met a guy called Brad, and moved to Queensland with him. Next thing we knew, she rang back to say they were engaged, but they never got married, and just lived together for 5 years. We never saw her for all that time, but she would send my mother a birthday present each year, and the family got a card from her at Christmas time, but apart from the occasional phone call, we didn't have much contact with her. About 4 months before my 18th birthday, my mother got a call from Aunt Stephanie, to say she had broken up with her fiancé, after all those years, and had arranged a job transfer back to our hometown, to make a fresh start. After a few more phone calls over the next few days, my parents offered to let Aunt Stephanie stay with us for a few weeks until she got a place of her own. None of this meant a great deal to me, because I hadn't seen her since I was 12, but my sister and I set about getting the spare room set up for our aunt, until she found somewhere of her own. When you think about it, I was probably not much different from most 17-year-old guys. Pretty standard, I guess. I'd only ever had one girlfriend, whose name was Sally, but after we had been going together for a few months, her dad, who was in the army, got transferred to another unit in a different state, so that was the end of that. Stephanie was due to arrive that afternoon. And both our parents were at work, so it was up to Casey and me to meet her when she arrived. When the doorbell rang, a few minutes later, I knew who to expect, but I got a surprise when opened the door, and saw what she looked like. In reality, at 31, Aunt Stephanie didn't look much different from the way she did 5 years before, but I was remembering her through the eyes of a 12-year-old, and I have to say that through the eyes of a horny 17-year-old, she looked a whole lot better. She was about 5 feet 6, but just right, and a pretty face, that was full of life. She had hazel eyes, and her wavy hair was a light brown color, a little lighter than I remembered, growing halfway down her back, and her 5 years in the Queensland sun had given her a soft, even suntan. I had expected her to look like a younger version of my mother, but she actually looked like a very hot girl, who had just a faint resemblance to her. I was impressed, and suddenly the thought of this extremely attractive woman staying with us for a while became much more appealing to me. She looked at me almost blankly when I opened the door, and then as she recognized me, she said, "Oh my God. Glenn. I can't believe how much you've grown." I'd been through 2 growth spurts since she last saw me, so I guess I did look pretty different. She gave me a hug, and then stood back again to look at me. "You must be 2 feet taller." "I guess I've grown a bit," I said, feeling kind of stupid after I said it, and wishing I had thought of something more cool to say. I took Aunt Stephanie into the family room to meet Casey, and after some hugs and kisses on the cheek, we sat around talking for the rest of the afternoon, until our parents came home, and I could hardly keep my eyes off her the whole time. The next day was a Saturday, and Stephanie spent the day in a short, cream-colored, linen skirt, and I saw that she had a beautiful set of toned, tanned, and well-shaped legs that were entirely in keeping. Aunt Stephanie stayed with us for a little over 3 weeks. And on the first day, she made it clear to my sister, Casey, and me, that she didn't want any of this Aunt Stephanie bullshit. She wanted to be called Steph, so that's what we called her. During those 3 weeks, I tried not to fantasize about her, because after all she was my aunt, but seeing her walking around the house dressed the way she did, day after day. I even saw my dad copping an eyeful of her a few times, not that I blamed him. My mother had put on a little weight since her mid-30s, but she still had a curvy body and a pretty face, and I think she, judging by some things I heard them say to each other, and the noises I heard from their room late some nights, but even the Archbishop of Canterbury would have taken a second look at Aunt Stephanie. In fact, he'd probably kick out one of his stained glass windows to see which way she went. Before long, Stephanie found herself a small, 2-bedroom house on the other side of town, and I was a little disappointed to see her move out, but seeing most of her friends from before she went away had either moved on themselves, or were now out of circulation, we still saw a lot of her after she moved into her own house. She had shown when she stayed with us that she was an accomplished cook, and she had us over for dinner a few times, and she spent a fair bit of time at our place. Although she was over 30, Stephanie had a young outlook, a funny sense of humor, and she even liked some of the same music as me. And we got on pretty well together. She looked like a girl in her 20s, and when she was around, I could hardly keep my eyes off her. Now an Againk, now that she had no man in her life, but I thought it wouldn't be long before someone new came along. I thought a girl who looked like her could probably pick and choose anyone she wanted. About a month after Stephanie moved out, my parents were due to take my sister, Casey, to the baton twirling tournament she had been practicing for. The tournament was 300 kilometers from home, and the plan was to leave town on Friday afternoon and stay overnight for 2 nights, then come back home on Sunday. My dad must have realized I didn't relish the thought of spending the weekend watching a bunch of little girls marching around, throwing batons in the air, so he and my mother decided to let me stay home. Then, my mother came up with the idea of letting me stay with Auntie Steph, as she insisted on calling her, so she could cook for me, and we would be company for each other. Naturally, I was pretty pleased to be spending the weekend with Stephanie, thinking I would get an eyeful of her every chance I got, and she was always fun to be around anyway, and Stephanie seemed quite happy about it, too. I'd had a license for about 5 months, so my parents left my mother's car with me, and the idea was for me to drive over to Stephanie's place, after school on the Friday afternoon, because they were leaving with Casey at midday. After I got my act together, I didn't leave home until about 5 o'clock, so I got to Stephanie's place late just after 5. She met me at the door, dressed in a short denim skirt, and a pair of gold-colored sandals. She didn't look like anybody's aunt. She smiled wide, and said, "Come in, Glenn, I thought you must have forgotten." "No, just disorganized," I answered, walking in the door. "Come and put your stuff in the spare bedroom," she said, "I've made the bed up for you." She walked ahead of me toward the bedroom, and from behind. After I had put my things in the spare bedroom, we went to the kitchen. Stephanie made us both coffee, and we sat and talked for a while, sitting on opposite sides of the breakfast bar. Got any plans for tonight? Stephanie asked. No, I answered. What about you? Well, Stephanie answered, I've got some DVDs here. You can have a look through them, and if there's anything you like, we can watch that. If you can't find anything you want to see, we can go to the video store and rent some. Sounds good, I said. I didn't think she noticed. Stephanie stood up, and picked up her coffee, and said, I've got most of my stuff put away now, but I can't remember where I put my DVDs. I'll just have a look in the lounge room for them. We walked towards her lounge room, and she started to look in some of her drawers. I stood there, watching her, and the phone rang in the kitchen. Can you grab that? Stephanie asked. I went to the kitchen and answered Stephanie's phone, but it was a telemarketer, trying to sell her a new phone plan. I put on a fake Slavic accent and told him he must have a wrong number, then hung up on him. I walked back to the lounge room, chuckling and planning to tell Stephanie what I had done, but when I got to the door, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Oh, shit. I heard her say inside the cupboard. She reached round pointlessly, and tugged. I was a little surprised at the question, but I said, honest answer. Yeah, Stephanie nodded, as if she already knew the answer, be honest. I can take it. Well, to tell you the truth. I said. Stephanie had cooked homemade Italian food for dinner, and she had a bottle of Lambrusco to go with it. She asked me if I drank red wine, and I told her I had some now and again, so we both had a couple of glasses each with our dinner. Over dinner, we talked about her job, plans she had for her house and stuff like that, plus we joked around together, as we usually did. During the time she had stayed at our place, I had found that Stephanie and I were kind of on the same wavelength with our sense of humor, and we could bounce jokes and stupid remarks off each other, and have fun together, even though she was much older. At one stage, she said, Glenn, have you got a girlfriend? I used to have one, but she moved away, I said, and I went on to tell her a bit about Sally. It wasn't like I had a broken heart or anything, but she said, I'm surprised a handsome young guy like you hasn't got a new girl by now. I was quite pleased with myself to hear her calling me a handsome young guy, but I thought she was just being nice, and although I knew nothing could ever happen between an aunt and her nephew, it still felt good. I could feel the effects of the red wine, and I guess Stephanie could too, and at one stage, she spoke about her time in Brisbane. Do you miss Brad? I asked. Sometimes, she answered, then went on with, I miss having a man in my life. And that kind of thing. I didn't expect her to continue, but she said. She went silent for a moment, and smiled like she was thinking of something. I'm surprised you said that, to me, anyway, I replied. Well, it's part of life, Stephanie said, nothing to be ashamed of. I didn't answer, but it occurred to me that it would be nice to help her with that problem. After dinner, Stephanie got up and started to wash the dishes, so I grabbed a dish towel to help. When she saw me with the towel, she said, tall, handsome, and helps with the dishes without being asked. You're gonna have girls lined up for you when word gets out. Well, I can't just eat and let you do all the work. I answered. As usual when we were together, we clowned around over the job. In retaliation, she flicked suds from the sink on my face, but then she grabbed a hand towel from the rack and began to dab my face dry. I could feel the warmth from them, and I could smell Stephanie's feminine scent, so my body responded. After we had done the dishes, Stephanie and I went to her lounge room, to watch a chick movie we had decided on from her DVD collection. While she was setting up her player, I saw some photo albums on the coffee table, that I hadn't noticed earlier, and I started to look through one of them. Stephanie saw me looking, and said, I haven't found a place for those yet. She sat down next to me on my right, on the two-seater couch, and started to show me some of the pictures in the album, and explain who was in them and when they were taken. We were sitting quite close together, on her couch, because it was only a two-seater, and this was not lost on me, as I smelt her scent. Some were of my parents, before I was born, and some of my mother when she was growing up, and Stephanie and I had a few laughs and giggles about the clothes, and things like that. Now and again, I would feel a wave of excitement going through me, as Stephanie leaned against me, to point out someone in the albums, or to explain something to me, especially if I smelt her hair. After a while, I looked at Stephanie and I said, "I haven't seen any of you when you were a teenager. Have you got any of those? Why do you want to see that?" She answered, making eye contact, smiling sweetly, "I just want to see what you look like," I said, smiling back. "Well, don't laugh when you see them," Stephanie said. "I was pretty thin when I was young." I wasn't sure if I should say this, in case Stephanie took it the wrong way, but I said, "So, all those curves are a relatively new thing?" "I didn't know you were taking notice," she smiled back. "Just because you're my aunt, doesn't mean I can't look," I said. "Guess not," she replied, looking down at herself. "So, what about those pictures?" I said, "In the blue album over there." Stephanie said, and I saw there was an album with a blue cover on the other side of the coffee table. I leaned forward to reach for it, but at the same moment. We had leaned forward together, neither of us realizing the other was going to do the same thing, and our faces were close together, as we both reached for the album. I turned to face Stephanie, in that position, and she turned to face me. Our faces were close, and our eyes met, and Stephanie seemed to take a breath, and she kissed me on the mouth. It was a soft, sweet, but very quick kiss, and she drew back, and looked at me as though she was surprised at herself, and said, "Sorry. Oh my God, sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." She sat back heavily on the couch, with a look of concern on her face, and said, "It must be the wine, and talking about Brad, I don't know. Sorry." She looked at me as though she was waiting for me to say something, but I was too surprised to say anything, although I was also very excited. "It's okay," I said. "I don't know what I was thinking," Stephanie repeated, shaking her head. "You must think I'm terrible." "No, I don't," I said, giving my head a quick shake. "Well," Stephanie said, a little warily, "what are you thinking? There's something going on in that head of yours. I can tell." I had nothing to lose, and I was too excited to really think about what I was saying. So what came out of my mouth was, "I was thinking, I wish I had time to kiss back." Stephanie's face started to smile, but it also looked like she was weighing things up in her mind. I realized that I had been so surprised. I was still leaning across the coffee table, with my hand towards the photo album, so I sat back on the couch next to her. "We could always try it again," Stephanie said. I looked at her, wondering if I had heard her right, or if I had misunderstood somehow. After all, she was my aunt. Stephanie looked at me for what was probably only a moment, but it seemed longer, and she said, "Well, we can't do it with you all the way over there." Then, with a kind of understanding smile, she leaned closer, and said, "Come on. I'll make it a little easier." Our faces were now only inches apart, and Stephanie gave me a sweet smile, and said almost in a whisper, "You're nervous, aren't you?" "A little bit," I said, understating the truth by a long way. "That's okay," Stephanie said, "there's no rush. We've got all night." I moved forward, and kissed Stephanie's soft mouth. Who would have thought that a kiss from your aunt could be so exciting? "I think so," I said, seriously. Stephanie looked down at her own hand on my thigh, and after a sigh, she looked up at me and said, "You and Sally never," pausing, looking for the right word. "So," she said, "you've never gone to bed with a girl?" "No," I said, again, shaking my head. She pouted for a moment, and still looking down, she said, "We've got all night, you know." She took a deep breath, and this time, looked up at me, and said, "So, what I'm saying to you is, do you want to finish what we've started here?" "Yes, I do," I answered, "I'd love to." "I know it's your first time, Glenn," Stephanie started, "but we've got all night. There's no rush, and we can just take our time, but it'll be amazing." Stephanie smiled again, a little mischievous, a little understanding, and she said, "You like them, don't you?" "Of course I do," I smiled, "they're gorgeous." I couldn't believe I'd said gorgeous. But Stephanie said, "I've seen you looking a few times tonight." Then she paused again, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Not just tonight, either." "Sorry," I smiled, "I just couldn't help it." "You don't have to apologize," he said, "it's nice to get some attention." Then she added, "Would you like to touch them?" "Okay," I said, and I gently lifted her top up. Stephanie kissed me again, and said, "Would you like to come into my room with me? We'll be more comfortable in there." I could only nod, I was so nervous. Stephanie stood, and took my right hand in her left hand, and said, "Come on." I stood up as well, and we walked to her room, with Stephanie holding my hand, like we were two young lovers or something. Stephanie turned her body to face me, and said, "Would you like the light off? Can you leave it on?" I said, and then I haltingly added, "If that's okay." "Of course it's okay," Stephanie said, smiling. "What's that?" she said, smiling as if she expected it to be fun. "Turn around," I said, and she gave me a funny look, as though she wondered what I was up to. "It's okay, I just want to look at you from behind," I said, and Stephanie turned her back to me. I was so excited, I could hardly speak. "Yes, I remember," Stephanie said, turning to the right to look back at me over her shoulder. "You were great," I said, even though I had nothing to compare her with. "Well," Stephanie said, looked at me, "I'll tell you something else that's great." I looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "We've got all night, and all day tomorrow to practice. You up for that?" "Not yet, but it won't be long," I smiled back. "Pay attention, because I'll be asking questions afterwards." Stephanie smiled. Stephanie was my teacher, and I was her willing and attentive student, eager to learn and ready to put my lessons into practice. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise stated.